What if a young nation, barely 30 years old, dared to challenge the most powerful empire on earth and almost watched its own capital burn to ashes? This is not just a story of battles and generals. It's a story of fear, pride, burning cities, desperate soldiers, and a flag that refused to fall even under a sky filled with fire. From shocking defeats and heroic naval victories to the night Washington burned and the impossible triumph at New Orleans, the War of 1812 was a fight that shaped a nation's identity forever. Stay with me, because every minute of this story reveals courage, chaos, and the moments that decided whether a young country would survive or disappear into history. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. Opening scene, the edge of uncertainty. Imagine a nation barely out of childhood, its scars from revolution still fresh, its identity uncertain, its future fragile. The year is 1812. And the United States stands on the edge of a war it is not fully prepared to fight, yet cannot avoid. Across the Atlantic, the world is already burning in the fires of the Napoleonic Wars. Empires clash, oceans become battlegrounds, and in the middle of it all, a young republic struggles to defend its honor, its sovereignty, and its very survival. This is not just a story of generals and battles. It is a story of farmers turned soldiers, of sailors facing impossible odds, of families watching their towns burn. It is a war fought not only with muskets and cannons, but with fear, pride, and the stubborn belief that a nation could stand on its own. The road to war, pride, pressure, and provocation. In the early 1800s, Britain ruled the seas. Its navy stopped American ships, seized cargo, and forced thousands of American sailors into service. To Americans, it felt like an insult, a reminder that independence had not truly been secured. On the western frontier, tensions grew between settlers and Native American tribes resisting American expansion, many tribes receiving support from the British in Canada. In Congress, young leaders known as the War Hawks demanded action. They believed war would defend American honor and perhaps even bring Canada into the Union. President James Madison, cautious but cornered by public pressure and growing outrage, made the difficult decision. On June 18, 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain, the most powerful empire on earth. The decision was bold, some would say reckless. But to many Americans, it felt necessary. Early struggles, a nation learns the hard way. The opening months of the war were marked by confusion and failure. American forces attempted to invade Canada and suffered humiliating defeats. Poor coordination, inexperienced officers, and undertrained troops led to disaster. Detroit fell without a fight, shocking the nation. Morale plummeted. At sea, however, American sailors proved their strength. The USS Constitution earned the nickname Old Ironsides after defeating British warships in stunning victories. These moments of triumph lifted spirits at home. Newspapers celebrated each success as proof that the young nation could stand toe-to-toe with a global superpower. Yet the war remained uncertain. British blockades strangled American trade. Cities feared invasion. Families waited anxiously for letters that might never arrive. A human cost lives in the shadow of war beyond strategy and politics, where ordinary people living through extraordinary fear. Farmers abandoned fields to fight. Mothers said goodbye to sons unsure if they would return. Native American communities faced devastating losses as they resisted American expansion and found themselves caught in a brutal struggle for survival. One of the most tragic figures of the war was Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader who dreamed of a united Native Confederacy. Fighting alongside the British, he sought to protect his people's land and way of life. His death in battle in 1813 shattered that dream and marked a turning point that opened vast territories to American expansion, often at terrible cost to indigenous nations. War does not choose its victims carefully. It spreads suffering widely and leaves scars long after the cannons fall silent. Turning points. courage in dark moments. As the war dragged on, both sides faced exhaustion. But in 1814, Britain, having defeated Napoleon in Europe, shifted its full attention to America. Veteran British troops launched major offensives along the eastern coast. Then came one of the most shocking moments of the war. The burning of Washington, D.C. British forces marched into the capital and set fire to the White House and other government buildings. Smoke filled the sky, and many Americans feared the nation itself might collapse. Yet, in the face of devastation came resilience. At Fort McHenry in Baltimore, American defenders endured relentless bombardment. Through the long night, rockets lit the sky and bombs shook the earth. When dawn came, the American flag still flew over the fort, a symbol of defiance that inspired Francis Scott Key to write the words that would become the U.S. national anthem. In that moment, the war became more than politics or territory. It became a test of spirit, the final battles, honor, and irony. Even as diplomats in Europe negotiated peace, soldiers continued to fight. The Treaty of Ghent was signed in December 1814, officially ending the war, but news traveled slowly. Weeks later, in January 1815, one of the war's most famous battles took place in New Orleans. General Andrew Jackson led a diverse force. Frontiersmen freed African Americans, native allies, and pirates against a powerful British army. Against all expectations, the Americans achieved a decisive victory. The battle became a symbol of national pride, even though peace had technically already been agreed upon. It was a reminder of the strange timing of history and of how wars are often remembered through their final dramatic moments rather than their long, painful struggles. Aftermath: victory without conquest. When the smoke cleared, the borders between the United States and Canada remained largely unchanged. No great territory had been won, no decisive conquest achieved. Yet something profound had shifted. Americans felt a renewed sense of identity and independence. The war proved they could survive against a powerful enemy. Britain, meanwhile, began to see the United States less as a rebellious colony and more as a sovereign nation. But the consequences were complex. Native American resistance in the Northwest was severely weakened, leading to rapid American expansion and deepening displacement of indigenous communities. Economically, the war encouraged domestic industry as Americans learned to rely less on foreign imports. It was not a simple victory. It was a transformation, messy, painful, and deeply human. Closing reflection: the meaning of the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is sometimes called America's Second War of Independence. But beyond slogans and textbooks lies a more complicated truth. It was a war born from pride and pressure, fought with courage and confusion, and remembered through both triumph and tragedy. It tested a young nation's resilience. It reshaped relationships across a continent, and it left behind stories of bravery, sacrifice, loss, and hope. History often speaks in dates and treaties, but behind every battle were people, scared, determined, imperfect, trying to defend what they believed mattered most. Their voices echo through time, reminding us that nations are not built only by victories, but by the courage to endure when the future is uncertain. The War of 1812 was not the largest war, nor the deadliest, yet it remains one of the most defining chapters in the early life of the United States, a moment when a fragile republic stood in the storm and refused to fall. And perhaps that is the true legacy of this conflict, not the burning cities or the famous battles, but the realization that a nation's strength is measured not only by its power, but by its resilience, its unity, and the human spirit that carries it forward through the darkest nights of history. In the early years of the 19th century, the United States was a fragile republic that had only recently secured its independence, yet it still lived in the long shadow of European empires. Across the Atlantic, Britain and France were locked in the massive struggle of the Napoleonic Wars, and the world's oceans had become dangerous battlegrounds where neutral nations found themselves squeezed between rival powers. American merchant ships, once symbols of independence and opportunity, suddenly became targets of suspicion and control. The British Royal Navy, desperate for manpower to sustain its global dominance, began stopping American vessels on the open sea, searching for alleged deserters. In practice, this policy, known as impressment, often meant forcibly taking American sailors and compelling them into British service. Thousands of men were seized in this way, leaving families behind and sparking outrage throughout the young nation. To Americans, impressment felt like a humiliating reminder that Britain still viewed them as subjects rather than citizens. And each incident deepened the sense that their hard-won independence was being disrespected. Trade restrictions compounded this anger. Both Britain and France attempted to choke each other's economies through blockades and decrees, and American merchants became collateral damage in a global economic war. Britain's Orders in Council restricted neutral trade with France and authorized the seizure of ships that violated these rules, while Napoleon's continental system threatened retaliation against those who traded with Britain. American traders found themselves trapped in an impossible situation, punished no matter which direction they sailed. Cargoes were confiscated, livelihoods destroyed, and once thriving ports fell into economic uncertainty for a nation whose economy really fed heavily on maritime commerce. These disruptions felt like an existential threat. Farmers who depended on exports saw prices collapse, sailors lost work, and shipbuilders watched their industry falter. What began as distant European conflicts suddenly became deeply personal struggles for American families trying to survive in a volatile global market. At home, political tensions intensified as leaders debated how to respond. Some advocated diplomacy and economic pressure, hoping that embargoes and negotiations might protect American interests without resorting to violence. Others grew increasingly frustrated with what they saw as endless humiliation. A new generation of politicians, known as the war hawks, emerged in Congress, driven by youthful nationalism and a belief that the United States had to assert its rights through strength. Figures like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun argued that war was not only necessary to defend national honor, but also an opportunity to reshape the balance of power in North America. Their speeches stirred emotions among citizens who felt that patience had brought little respect from foreign powers. They framed the conflict not simply as a reaction to British policies, but as a defining test of American sovereignty and courage. Beyond the oceans and political chambers, tensions simmered on the western frontier, where American settlers pushed into lands long inhabited by Native American tribes. Expansion brought conflict, fear, and uncertainty to the region. Native communities resisted encroachment, seeking to defend their homes and cultures against a rapidly growing nation. Many American settlers believed that British agents in Canada were encouraging and supporting indigenous resistance as a way to weaken the United States from within. Whether exaggerated or grounded in reality, these fears fueled anger and suspicion. Violent clashes erupted, and frontier families lived in constant anxiety, unsure when the next attack might come. To them, the war was not an abstract diplomatic dispute, but a struggle for survival and security. Among the Native American leaders who emerged during this period was Tecumseh, a Shawnee chief who envisioned a confederacy that could unite diverse tribes in a common defense against American expansion. His movement represented both hope and desperation, a final effort to preserve independence and territory in the face of relentless pressure. For many Americans, Tecumseh's alliance with the British reinforced the belief that foreign powers were actively threatening their borders. Meanwhile, for indigenous communities, the conflict was not about European politics or maritime law, but about the preservation of their land and identity. The frontier became a place where cultures collided, alliances shifted, and the human cost of expansion grew increasingly severe. Economic strain and national pride combined to shape public opinion. Newspapers published stories of seized ships and captured sailors, turning individual tragedies into symbols of national injustice. Political rallies echoed with calls for action, and ordinary citizens debated the future of their country in taverns, marketplaces, and churches. Some Americans feared that war would devastate an already fragile economy, while others believed that only a firm response could secure long-term respect and stability. Regional division added complexity, with some states more eager for confrontation than others, reflecting differing economic interests and political ideologies. President James Madison faced enormous pressure from all sides. Known for his cautious temperament and commitment to Republican ideals, he initially sought to avoid armed conflict through diplomacy and economic measures. However, each new incident at sea and each report of frontier violence made restraint more difficult to justify. Madison had to balance competing priorities, protecting American sovereignty, preserving economic stability, and preventing the young nation from being drawn into a potentially disastrous war. As Congress debated and public sentiment shifted, the sense grew that the United States had reached a crossroads where inaction might be seen as weakness. The decision to declare war in June 1812 was shaped by a complex web of grievances rather than a single spark. Impressment symbolized the struggle for respect on the world stage. Trade restrictions threatened economic survival. Frontier conflicts raised fears about national security, and rising nationalism fueled a desire to prove that the United States could stand as an equal among powerful nations. For many Americans, the war represented a chance to defend their honor and independence once again, even as doubts lingered about whether the country was truly prepared for the immense challenges ahead. When the United States entered the War of 1812, confidence among some political leaders was high, but the reality on the ground was far more uncertain. The nation's military was small, underfunded, and largely untested in large-scale warfare against a professional European army. Many Americans believed that invading Canada would be quick and relatively easy, assuming that British forces were weak and that Canadian settlers might welcome American control. This belief proved dangerously optimistic. As the first campaigns unfolded, the United States faced a harsh lesson about the gap between ambition and preparation. And the early stages of the war were marked by confusion, poor coordination, and painful defeats that shook public confidence. One of the earliest and most shocking setbacks occurred in Detroit in 1812. General William Hull led American forces into the Michigan Territory with orders to push into Canada, but logistical problems and fear quickly undermined his campaign. Supplies were scarce, communication was unreliable, and the troops were a mixture of inexperienced regular soldiers and militia who had never faced sustained combat. When British General Isaac Brock advanced with a smaller force supported by Native American warriors under Tecumseh, Hull became convinced that his position was hopeless. Rather than risk a bloody confrontation, he surrendered Detroit without a fight, handing over soldiers, weapons, and an entire territory. The news stunned Americans across the country who had expected early victories. Instead, they saw a symbol of weakness that emboldened British and Native forces while lowering morale at home. The failure at Detroit was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of disorganization. American leaders struggled to coordinate multiple invasion plans across the vast northern frontier. Armies moved slowly through difficult terrain, often lacking proper maps, transportation, or clear lines of command. Rivalries between officers created confusion, and political appointments sometimes placed inexperienced commanders in positions of authority. Militia units, which formed a large part of the American force, were often reluctant to cross into Canadian territory, believing their duty was limited to defending their own states. This created delays and fractured strategies that allowed British defenders to regroup and counterattack. In the Niagara frontier, American troops attempted to advance into Upper Canada, but faced stiff resistance and struggled with discipline and leadership. Soldiers marched through harsh conditions, uncertain about their objectives and poorly supplied with food and ammunition. The Battle of Queenston Heights in October 1812 became another painful reminder of the nation's unpreparedness. Although American forces initially gained ground, reinforcements failed to arrive in time and militia refused to cross the river to support the troops already engaged in battle. British forces, supported by native allies, mounted a strong counterattack that forced the Americans to surrender. The defeat exposed weaknesses in training and unity, leaving many Americans questioning the effectiveness of their army. Beyond the battlefield, the early failures had a deep emotional impact on the public. Newspapers that had once predicted easy victories began reporting on losses and confusion. Families waiting for news from the front lines felt growing anxiety as letters described hunger, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Volunteers who had marched off with patriotic enthusiasm returned home disillusioned, sharing stories of poor leadership and chaotic planning. Political divisions widened as critics of the war argued that the government had underestimated the strength of its enemy and overestimated its own readiness. British strategy during this period focused on defense and containment rather than large-scale invasions. With much of their military committed to fighting Napoleon in Europe, British commanders relied on strong fortifications, experienced officers, and alliances with Native American forces to hold their ground in Canada. Their success in repelling American advances boosted morale among Canadian settlers and strengthened loyalty to the British Crown. For Indigenous warriors fighting alongside British forces, early victories offered a temporary sense of security against American expansion, reinforcing alliances that played a crucial role in shaping the conflict's early dynamics. The American Navy, though small, provided some moments of hope during this otherwise difficult period. While land campaigns struggled, naval victories on the open seas demonstrated the courage and skill of American sailors. Ships like the USS Constitution earned fame by defeating British warships in dramatic encounters, proving that American forces could succeed under the right conditions. These successes, however, could not fully offset the disappointment and frustration caused by repeated failures on land. For soldiers stationed along the northern frontier, the harsh realities of war remained unchanged, marked by cold winters, muddy camps, and constant uncertainty. Leadership challenges continued to plague the American war effort. Officers disagreed over strategy, and communication between different regions was slow and unreliable. Supply lines broke down, leaving troops without adequate equipment or medical care. Disease spread through camps, claiming lives even when battles did not. Morale fluctuated as soldiers struggled to maintain confidence in commanders who seemed unprepared for the complexities of modern warfare. The lack of a unified national strategy created an atmosphere where individual bravery could not compensate for systemic weaknesses. As winter set in during the early campaigns, the realities of war became impossible to ignore. Soldiers endured freezing temperatures and inadequate shelter, while frontier communities braced for raids and counterattacks. Farmers living near the border abandoned homes to seek safety farther south, leaving fields untended and families divided. Native American communities faced their own devastating losses as battles intensified and alliances drew them deeper into a conflict that threatened their survival. The early phase of the War of 1812 became a period of painful learning for the United States. Mistakes revealed the importance of experienced leadership, effective training, and clear communication. While some leaders began to push for reforms and better organization, the damage to national pride had already been done. Americans who had expected a swift and glorious campaign were forced to confront the sobering reality that independence did not guarantee military strength. The young nation, still searching for its identity and confidence, faced the daunting task of rebuilding its strategy while continuing to fight an enemy with centuries of military experience and global power. As the War of 1812 unfolded and American forces struggled on land, a different story began to emerge on the open seas, where courage, skill, and determination reshaped the narrative of a young nation fighting for respect. The United States Navy was small compared to the vast power of the British Royal Navy, yet it possessed well-built ships, disciplined crews, and officers who understood the importance of speed, precision, and morale. For a country shaken by early defeats along the Canadian border, the victories at sea offered a desperately needed sense of hope and pride. Each successful engagement became more than a military achievement. It was a reminder that Americans could stand against the world's most powerful empire and win. One of the most iconic symbols of this rising confidence was the USS Constitution, a heavy frigate built with thick oak planking that earned it the nickname Old Ironsides. When the Constitution encountered the British warship HMS Guerriere in August 1812, many observers expected the British vessel to dominate the battle. Instead, American gunnery proved devastatingly accurate, and British cannonballs seemed to bounce harmlessly off the Constitution's sturdy hull. As the battle raged, American sailors demonstrated remarkable discipline, firing coordinated broadsides that shattered the enemy ship's masts and morale. When the Guerriere finally surrendered, news of the victory spread rapidly through American cities, sparking celebrations and transforming public perception of the war. The psychological impact of these naval successes was enormous. Newspapers described the bravery of American crews in vivid detail, portraying them as heroes defending national honor against overwhelming odds. Citizens gathered in taverns and town squares to hear updates read aloud, cheering each new report of British ships defeated or captured. After months of discouraging news from the northern frontier, these stories provided a powerful emotional boost. Sailors who had once been seen as minor players in a land-focused war suddenly became central figures in the national imagination, symbols of resilience and skill. Other American ships followed the Constitution's example, achieving victories that challenged the myth of British invincibility at sea. The USS United States defeated HMS Macedonian in a fierce engagement, capturing the enemy vessel and bringing it back to an American port as a trophy. The USS Wasp achieved its own triumphs, demonstrating that even smaller ships could overcome powerful adversaries through clever maneuvering and relentless determination. These victories were not accidental, but reflected careful preparation, superior training, and an understanding of how to exploit the strengths of American frigates, which were often larger and more heavily armed than their British counterparts in single-ship duels. For American sailors, life aboard these ships was both harsh and exhilarating. Crews faced cramped quarters, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of sudden death from cannon fire or splintered wood. During battles, the air filled with smoke and deafening noise, and every movement required coordination and trust. Officers relied on experienced gunners who could reload and fire with remarkable speed, while young midshipmen ran messages across slippery decks under enemy fire. Victory demanded not only bravery, but also discipline, teamwork, and an unshakable belief in the mission. These naval triumphs carried strategic as well as emotional significance. By challenging British ships in direct combat, American captains forced the Royal Navy to take the young nation more seriously as a maritime power. Although Britain still dominated the oceans and maintained a powerful blockade that limited American trade, the early successes demonstrated that the United States could inflict real damage and defend its interests. For a country whose identity was closely tied to freedom of the seas and commercial independence. These victories were seen as proof that American sailors could protect their nation's rights. The stories of individual sailors added a human dimension to the conflict. Many came from humble backgrounds, including fishermen, farmers' sons, and immigrants seeking opportunity. On deck, distinctions of class and origin faded as crews united around shared risks and responsibilities. Letters sent home described moments of terror and triumph, capturing the emotional highs and lows of life at sea. Families waiting on the shore anxiously scanned newspapers for news of battles, hoping to see the names of ships associated with their loved ones among the victorious rather than the lost. American naval officers also understood the importance of symbolism. Captured British flags were displayed in public ceremonies, and victorious crews were welcomed home with parades and celebrations. These events reinforced national unity and provided a sense of purpose during a time when the war's outcome remained uncertain. Even critics of the conflict found it difficult to deny the skill and bravery displayed by American sailors, and the Navy became one of the few institutions that commanded widespread respect across political divisions. British reactions to these defeats were mixed, ranging from shock to determination. While the Royal Navy remained vastly superior in overall strength, it began to adapt its tactics, avoiding one-on-one engagements with American heavy frigates whenever possible. Instead, Britain focused on blockading American ports and using its numerical advantage to restrict commerce. This strategy limited the opportunities for dramatic American victories as the war progressed, but the early successes had already left a lasting impression on both sides of the Atlantic. As the war continued, the initial naval triumphs became a cornerstone of American national identity. Songs, poems, and paintings celebrated the bravery of sailors and the strength of ships like the Constitution. For a generation that had grown up hearing stories of the Revolutionary War, these victories offered a new chapter of heroism, reinforcing the belief that the United States could defend its independence against even the most powerful adversaries. The sea, once a source of vulnerability due to British dominance, became a stage where American courage and ingenuity could shine brightly, inspiring a nation searching for confidence in the midst of uncertainty and conflict. By 1814, the global balance of power had shifted dramatically. With Napoleon defeated in Europe, Britain was finally able to turn its full military strength toward North America. Veteran soldiers who had fought in some of Europe's fiercest battles crossed the Atlantic, bringing discipline, experience, and confidence that American forces had rarely faced before. The United States, already strained by years of conflict and economic disruption, now confronted an enemy capable of launching large-scale offensives along multiple fronts. Coastal communities braced for invasion, and fear spread through cities that had once felt distant from the war's violence. British strategy focused on striking key American targets to weaken morale and disrupt government operations. In the summer of 1814, British forces landed in the Chesapeake Bay region, moving with speed and precision through Maryland. American troops attempted to halt their advance at the Battle of Bladensburg, but poor coordination and inexperienced militia units struggled against seasoned British regulars. The American defense quickly collapsed, leaving the road to Washington, D.C. dangerously exposed. Panic spread through the capital as government officials scrambled to evacuate documents and prepare for the unthinkable, the capture of the nation's political heart. When British troops entered Washington, they found a city largely abandoned by its defenders in a calculated act intended to retaliate for earlier American actions in Canada and to demonstrate the vulnerability of the young republic. They set fire to government buildings, including the White House and the Capitol. Flames consumed symbols of American governance as thick smoke rose into the sky, visible for miles. Citizens who remained watched in horror as their capital burned, fearing that the destruction signaled the collapse of their country's fragile independence. The psychological impact was immense, shaking national confidence and exposing how unprepared the United States was to defend its own center of power. President James S. Madison and other leaders fled the city, carrying with them important documents and the weight of uncertainty about what would come next. Stories emerged of ordinary citizens risking their lives to save national treasures, including the famous portrait of George Washington rescued from the White House before flames engulfed the building. The burning of Washington became a powerful symbol both of humiliation and of resilience as Americans struggled to reconcile the devastation with their determination to continue fighting. Despite this dramatic victory, British commanders faced challenges of their own. Harsh weather, stretched supply lines, and determined American resistance complicated their plans for further conquests. After leaving Washington, British forces turned their attention toward Baltimore, a strategic port city known for its shipyards and privateers that had disrupted British trade throughout the war. Baltimore's citizens prepared for a fierce defense, fortifying positions and rallying militia units alongside regular troops. Unlike the disorganized resistance at Bladensburg, the defense of Baltimore reflected lessons learned from earlier failures. The Battle of Baltimore unfolded on both land and sea. British troops attempted to advance toward the city while their navy launched a massive bombardment of Fort McHenry, which guarded the harbor entrance. For more than 25 hours, British ships fired rockets and shells into the fort, lighting up the night sky with flashes of fire. Inside the fort, American soldiers endured relentless explosions, smoke, and fear as they struggled to maintain their defenses. Each blast threatened to break their lines, yet defenders refused to surrender, determined to hold their position at any cost. Among those witnessing the bombardment was Francis Scott Key, an American lawyer who had boarded a British ship to negotiate the release of a prisoner. From his vantage point on the water, he watched the intense assault and anxiously searched for signs that the fort still held. As dawn approached and the smoke began to clear, he saw the American flag still flying above Fort McHenry, a powerful image that captured the spirit of defiance that had taken root in the nation's darkest hours. Inspired by what he witnessed, Key penned words that would later become the lyrics of the Star-Spangled Banner, transforming a moment of survival into a lasting symbol of national pride. The successful defense of Baltimore marked a turning point in American morale. While the burning of Washington had exposed vulnerability, the resilience at Fort McHenry demonstrated that Americans could learn from their mistakes and mount effective resistance against a formidable enemy. Citizens across the country celebrated the news, and the story of the flag surviving the bombardment became a rallying cry for unity and perseverance. The contrast between the humiliation of Washington's destruction and the triumph of Baltimore's defense illustrated the complex emotional journey of a nation under siege. For the soldiers who fought during this period, the experiences were intense and deeply personal. Many had seen their homes threatened or destroyed, and the fear of invasion weighed heavily on their minds. Militia units that had once hesitated to engage now fought with renewed determination, driven by a desire to protect their communities from further devastation. Families in coastal regions lived with constant anxiety, unsure whether British ships might appear on the horizon at any moment. The British offensives of 1814 also revealed the strategic importance of coastal defenses and the need for better coordination among American forces. Leaders began to recognize the value of fortified positions and improved training lessons that would influence future military planning. At the same time, the emotional scars left by the burning of Washington lingered, serving as a reminder of how fragile the young nation remained in the face of global power struggles. As battles raged along the eastern seaboard, the war took on a more personal and symbolic meaning for Americans. The destruction of their capital city and the heroic defense of Fort McHenry became intertwined narratives of vulnerability and resilience, shaping how citizens understood the conflict and their place within it. Fear, anger, pride, and hope coexisted in a complex emotional landscape as the United States struggled to defend its sovereignty against one of the most powerful empires in the world, while proving to itself that even in moments of devastation, the spirit of resistance could endure through unity, sacrifice, and an unbreakable belief in the survival of the nation's ideals and identity through relentless adversity and courage under fire. By late 1814, years of conflict had left both the United States and Great Britain exhausted. Trade had been disrupted. Families had endured loss and uncertainty, and soldiers on both sides had grown weary of endless campaigns. In Europe, the defeat of Napoleon shifted global priorities, allowing British leaders to reconsider the costs and benefits of continuing a war in North America that no longer seemed strategically necessary. Diplomats from both nations gathered in the city of Ghent, in present-day Belgium, to negotiate an end to the conflict. The talks were slow and tense, reflecting the deep mistrust that had developed over years of war and political tension. Each side hoped to protect its national honor while avoiding further bloodshed, even as news from distant battlefields continued to shape the atmosphere of the negotiations. The American delegation faced a delicate challenge. They needed to secure peace without appearing weak to a public that had already endured humiliation and sacrifice. British negotiators, confident in their military strength but aware of the growing costs of maintaining overseas campaigns, sought terms that would restore stability without committing to prolonged conflict. After months of discussion, both sides agreed to a treaty that essentially restored pre-war boundaries and resolved few of the issues that had originally sparked the conflict. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on December 24, 1814, called for a return to the status quo ante bellum, meaning that conquered territories would be returned and neither side would claim victory through territorial gains. However, the realities of 19th century communication meant that the signing of the treaty did not immediately end the fighting. News traveled slowly across the Atlantic, and military commanders in North America continued to prepare for battles, unaware that peace had already been negotiated. This delay set the stage for one of the most dramatic and legendary engagements of the entire war, the Battle of New Orleans. The city was a vital port at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and its control was seen as crucial for trade and strategic influence in the region. British forces launched a major offensive aimed at capturing the city, believing that a decisive victory there could strengthen their position even as diplomatic talks concluded overseas. General Andrew Jackson emerged as a central figure in the defense of New Orleans. A controversial and fiercely determined leader, Jackson gathered a diverse force that reflected the complex social landscape of the young nation. His army included regular soldiers, frontier militia, free African Americans, Native American allies, Creole volunteers, and even pirates under the command of the infamous John Lafitte. These men came from different backgrounds, spoke different languages, and held different motivations, yet they were united by a shared goal of protecting the city from invasion. Jackson ordered the construction of defensive earthworks along the Rodriguez Canal, creating a fortified line designed to slow and disrupt the advancing British troops. The British army that approached New Orleans consisted of experienced soldiers hardened by years of fighting in Europe. They expected a swift and decisive victory against what they perceived as an inferior force. However, the Americans' strategic positioning and defensive preparations transformed the battlefield into a deadly obstacle course. On January 8, 1815, British forces launched a direct assault against Jackson's entrenched line. As they advanced across open ground, American artillery and riflemen unleashed devastating fire, cutting down wave after wave of attackers. The battle was brief but extraordinarily one-sided, with British casualties mounting rapidly while American losses remained comparatively low. The victory at New Orleans became an instant symbol of national pride and resilience. News of the triumph spread quickly through American cities, arriving almost simultaneously with word of the Treaty of Ghent. For many citizens, the dramatic defeat of a powerful British force overshadowed the technical reality that the war had already ended. Instead, the battle was remembered as proof that the United States had grown stronger through adversity and could defend itself against even the most formidable enemies. Andrew Jackson's reputation soared, eventually propelling him toward the presidency and shaping American politics for years to come. Beyond the battlefield, the end of the war brought complex consequences that reshaped North America. The borders between the United States and British Canada remained largely unchanged, reinforcing the idea that the conflict had been fought more for national identity and honor than for territorial conquest. For Americans, the survival of their nation against a global superpower fostered a renewed sense of unity and confidence. Political divisions that had once threatened to fracture the country began to ease as citizens embraced a shared narrative of perseverance and resilience. The war's aftermath also had profound and often tragic implications for Native American nations. With the British no longer actively supporting indigenous resistance along the frontier, American expansion accelerated into territories that had once been fiercely contested. Many Native communities faced displacement, loss of land, and the erosion of traditional ways of life. The death of leaders like Tecumseh earlier in the war had already weakened organized resistance, and the post-war period marked a turning point that shifted the balance of power decisively in favor of the United States. Economically, the war had disrupted foreign trade and forced Americans to rely heavily on domestic manufacturing. Industries that developed during the conflict continued to grow after peace was restored, laying the groundwork for future economic expansion. The Navy's successes and the Army's eventual improvements also influenced military reforms, encouraging leaders to invest in better training, infrastructure, and strategic planning. For ordinary citizens, the end of the war meant the return of soldiers, the rebuilding of burned towns, and the slow process of healing from years of uncertainty. Veterans carried memories of battlefields and fallen comrades, while families tried to reestablish normal lives in a nation that had been tested by fire. Songs, poems, and stories celebrated the heroes of New Orleans and other battles, creating a cultural legacy that shaped how future generations understood the conflict. The war became known to many Americans as a second war of independence, reinforcing the belief that their nation had proven its strength and legitimacy on the world stage, even as its deeper social and political challenges continued to evolve and reshape the country's identity through ongoing struggles and transformations that define the era's historical legacy and emotional resonance across generations and communities affected by the sweeping consequences of war and fragile peace. that followed years of conflict and sacrifice across land and sea without pause or certainty. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.